Hello, and thank you for reviewing this webinar today. We will be discussing strategies for responding to inappropriate student behavior. I am Jessica Smith, and I'm the substitute teacher trainer here at Steady.org. Before we begin, there's a couple of points I'd like to emphasize. First, when at times we focus so much on responding to inappropriate student behavior that we forget that it's more important to focus on preventing inappropriate student behavior. So I'd really encourage you to take time to review the Subinar we did in September when we talked about preventing inappropriate student behavior. The second point that I'd like you to consider comes from the financial wizard Robert Kiyosaki. In his book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, he discusses the importance of always keeping our brains thinking. He states that when people say, "I can't afford that," it turns their brains instantly off. Instead, we should think, "How can I afford that?" so that we then start coming up with creative ways to help ourselves afford something. Likewise, during this webinar, I would encourage you, instead of thinking, "This won't work for the students that I substitute teach," ask yourself, "How can this strategy work for the students I teach?" It's important for substitute teachers to keep learning, and by keeping our brain going, this is one way we can do that. All right, let's get started with these strategies for responding to inappropriate student behavior. Teachers have hundreds of small decisions that they have to make every day, and usually these are split-second decisions. One decision that we are going to have to learn to make is to distinguish between two types of inappropriate behavior. When we see something that is inappropriate for our classrooms, we need to distinguish whether this behavior is consequential or inconsequential. The reason we need to distinguish which type of behavior it is because we handle each of these behaviors differently. So what is inconsequential behavior? Inconsequential behavior is behavior that is just annoying. Now, these are things like students saying, "Teacher, teacher, teacher, teacher," or tapping their pencils on their desks. Now, I understand how raw these little behaviors can make our nerves, but we need to learn to, when we talk about controlling or classroom management and behavior management, we're learning to control our own behavior. Inconsequential behavior is not damaging to the learning environment. So these are just small behaviors that typically go away in about 30 seconds. And lastly, roughly 94% of inappropriate behavior is inconsequential. The biggest reward for students is teacher attention in any situation. Students often do things just to get the attention of the teacher. So we need to learn to pay attention to the positive behaviors that are found in the classroom, and this will help diminish the negative behaviors, and we'll go more into that later. For example, first we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we respond to inconsequential behavior? And that is one simple answer: we just ignore it. Now, when we don't ignore inconsequential behavior, it can easily turn into a bigger deal than it needs to be. A substitute teacher once told me of an experience she had in the classroom. She was taking roll and calling each student by name. One student started whistling. She gave him a very disappointed look and talked to him about how he can't whistle while she's taking roll. Another student thought this was funny and started whistling. Pretty soon, another student started whistling, and the whole class started whistling, and she had to call down the principal so the principal could talk with them about why it's inappropriate to whistle while the teacher's taking roll. This is the same idea that when little Angela runs up to us and says, "Fredo called me an idiot," what do we usually respond with in situations like these? We usually say, "Oh, just ignore him." One day, one of my students was treating his desk like a drum set. He would pound on it and pound on it. It was so annoying. The closer I got to him, the louder it became. But his behavior was inconsequential, so I just ignored it, as if to say, I have so many more important things to think about rather than your petty behavior. He kept going on for a few more seconds, so I tried an experiment. I stepped out of the room, and guess what happened? He stopped drumming that very instant. He was just wanting to get a rise out of me, and he never got it, so he stopped and went back to his assignment. I like the way Dr. Todd Whitaker says it in his book, What Great Teachers Do Differently. Great teachers have an incredible ability to ignore. This doesn't mean they are oblivious. Great teachers are aware of almost everything that happens in their classrooms. Nor does it mean that they have vast reserves of patience, although that helps. Rather, it reflects their mastery of the situations that arise daily in the life of schools. They know how easily one or two students can disrupt the flow of learning, but they also know when to go with the flow, when to take a stand, and how to quell minor disturbances without further distracting others. So we've been talking about inconsequential behavior, which is roughly 94% of the inappropriate behavior we see in classrooms, and we just ignore this inconsequential behavior. So what is consequential behavior? Consequential behavior is behavior that is damaging to the learning environment. Also, when students persist in being disruptive, and when students are physically or verbally abusive to one another. These are consequential behaviors, and they will not be tolerated in the classroom. Now, how do we respond to consequential behavior? We need to do this non-coercively. Now, we'll go in more in depth as to what are non-coercive strategies for responding to consequential behavior, but first we need to look at what is coercion. Coercion are attempts to achieve compliance through force or threats. Oftentimes, coercion involves interactions with students when teachers threaten them by force. The intent is to compel students to behave out of fear of what will happen to them if they do not. Coercion makes a student want to escape or avoid their coercer, and it does nothing to address the problem. There are a few problems with coercion. Coercion creates the image of compliance, but at best it instills a sense of fear in students that prevents them from acting out. While on the surface, the problem seems to have gone away, in reality, you have threatened the student's self-confidence and destroyed the atmosphere of a risk-free student classroom. So as we mentioned, coercion makes students want to escape or avoid the coercer, or they want to counter-coerce, or they get revenge. So when teachers use coercion in the classroom, it creates further problems for them in the future. Now, I think it's worth spending a minute or two on reviewing why substitute teachers sometimes use coercion. One, coercive methods may have been used in the schools they attended while growing up. Each of us have had a lot of experience in schools. We've gone to school and now we're teaching. And oftentimes we rely on the way we were taught on the best way of how we teach. Also, sometimes teachers think coercion works because they yell at a student or threaten a student, and all of a sudden this misbehaving student is complying. So it gives the image that coercion is working, however it has not. And lastly, teachers don't know a better way, and that's why we're having this webinar today, is to learn better ways of handling inappropriate student behavior that is consequential. Now remember, as we go through this webinar, I would encourage you to keep thinking, how can this work with the students I substitute teach? Non-coercive methods for responding to inappropriate student behavior. So when The behavior is inconsequential, it's annoying, typically lasts only about 30 seconds. We as teachers just ignore it. But if the behavior is consequential, here are some strategies to respond to that 6% of behavior. First, we need to praise appropriate behavior. This might seem disconnected, however, it is extremely connected. When students realize that teachers are looking for appropriate behavior and not focusing on inappropriate behavior, they really are more willing to comply with the teacher's expectations. Teachers should always ask the students to restate the expectation. If at the beginning of a class period you set an expectation when it comes to cell phones, and you see students with a consequence that follows, and you see students not complying with that expectation, you can walk over to him or her and calmly, in a very rational voice, say, "What is the expectation when it comes to cell phones, and what is the consequence of not obeying that expectation?" And so you might get a sarcastic reply, but just show that you're not fazed by it, and you're not backing down and say, "I asked you what the expectation of cell phones is today." And just keep your cool, and then follow through with the consequence that you set when you set that expectation at the start of class. Next, use proximity. I would encourage teachers to continually walk around the classroom. Be near the students. The closer you are to students, the more likely they are to comply with the expectations. Now, just as a side note, students appreciate when teachers are in control of their own behavior and can manage the misbehavior of students. When teachers resist students' attempts to intimidate them, teachers actually earn the students' respect. Now, this next one, we've titled it, Reevaluate the Situation. I would encourage you to not jump in too quickly to discipline students and make assumptions. If you have a group of students who will not stop talking, take a step back and see if you can determine why they are talking. Perhaps they don't understand the assignment and are trying to work it out together, or maybe something happened at lunchtime or at recess that needs to be addressed. If you find this to be the case, you may need to deal with that disruptive event, reteach the objective, or perhaps even restructure the assignment to be completed as a class or in small groups. Likewise, if an individual is acting out, realize that he or she may not understand the assignment. Note that students would rather look bad than stupid, so reevaluating the situation and restating your expectations are very helpful for students who don't understand the material. One of my favorite strategies is acknowledge and restate. This allows you as a teacher to show compassion, but also stick with the expectations set. So, for example, if a student is so annoyed with the assignment and they come up and say, "Oh, this assignment is so stupid, it doesn't even count on our grade," you can say, "I hear you. The assignments can be annoying sometimes. However, this is what we are going to do today," and then just walk away. I love having a third party to blame things on. "I'm sorry you're really annoyed with the cell phone policy, but it's what the district is requiring me to follow." Acknowledging and restating allows you to connect with the student, but then get him or her back on task immediately. Acknowledge how frustrating it is, but then restate the expectations, and then just casually walk away so that they will learn to comply with the expectations. A main goal of effective classroom management is to diffuse difficult situations. When students and teachers are emotionally involved, neither party makes very good decisions, and it's fairly important for teachers to stay emotionless to help students stay under control. As I mentioned earlier, students love when a teacher can control his or her own behavior and the behavior of the students. It helps students have respect for the teacher. This idea can be illustrated in the parable of the Dwight Schrute bobblehead. When I was teaching high school, I had a prized possession on my desk, my Dwight Schrute bobblehead. The students knew I loved this bobblehead. One day I turned my back for 1 second and several students erupted at each other. Sheer chaos had exploded in what seemed like less than 10 seconds. I turned around to see the students yelling and pointing at one another. It was so noisy that my coworker came in from next door to see what was going on. I'm a firm believer that the only behavior I can control is my own, so I walked over to the students and really calmly asked, "Will you please tell me what happened?" Immediately, the shouting and pointing began again. I turned to one student. "Javier, will you tell me what happened?" He began yelling, "She made me blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Javier, that's not what I asked. I asked what happened." Javier bent down and picked up the Dwight Schrute bobblehead. It had broke. He quietly handed it to me and said, "I'm sorry, Miss Smith. The bobblehead got knocked off your desk and it broke." Of course, I was devastated, but I remained calm and tried to stay emotionless and said, "Thanks, Javier, for telling me what happened. It can be fixed, so no one is to blame." And then walked away and looked back to see the students had immediately got back on task. It is key for a teacher to remain calm and clear thinking. Oftentimes, there will be situations when you have to speak to a student privately, and this can be really difficult to know what to say. So we'll go over a few steps that help when you need to speak with a student one-on-one. The goal of classroom management, in my opinion, is to get students on task. This is why I don't believe in over-questioning students about a situation or sending students to the office, because it doesn't meet the goal. If an individual student's behavior is consequential, the teacher needs to stop the behavior and redirect it to an appropriate activity. One way to do this is by asking the student to go to the doorway or the back of the room, somewhere private where the teacher can talk to the student. If this interaction is done in front of other students, it will become embarrassing for that student and thus make the interaction coercive. When needing to redirect a student, it's hard to know what to say. So here are 6 things that you will need to address when redirecting a student's behavior. They are: 1, say something positive. 2, briefly describe the problem behavior. 3, describe the desired alternative behavior. 4, give a reason why the new behavior is more desirable. 5, check for clarity. And 6, provide positive feedback. I'll give you an example of how simple this really is, even though it does look complicated. So let's say Dixie is a student who is in my class and she's talking really loudly and it's causing other students to stop their assignment and to talk with her. I go over quietly to Dixie and say, "I need to talk with you for a second. Would you please meet me in the doorway?" And then I step away, praising those students who are on task in the exact same voice that I used to talk with Dixie. When I get to the doorway, I smile and greet Dixie, thanking her for coming to the doorway so quickly. I would say something like this to her: "Dixie, I love having you in class. You are fun and lively, and this is exactly what this class needs. The other students also enjoy having you in class. It's really obvious. You make a lot of people smile when you say those funny things that you say. The other students look to you as a leader in this class, and when you start talking as loudly as you were in there, it causes other people to become off task, and I need them to be working on the assignment. Right now everyone is working so that we can play a game I had planned later. It would help everyone if you would work on your assignment too. So Dixie, what do I need you to be doing right now?" And then I'll wait for Dixie to respond. "Thanks a lot, Dixie. You're fun to have around, and I'll watch for you to keep working on your assignment." And then after about 30 seconds or so, I would watch for Dixie to get back on task and thank her for it. And I'll be honest, this is exactly what I'd say to my high school students. Senior boys, 18-year-old boys, I would follow this exact same pattern. When talking privately with Dixie, my goal wasn't to punish her, it's to get her back on task. Because this is my goal, it's really easy for me to remain calm. Another strategy we can rely on when it comes to responding to inappropriate behavior is reinforcing consequences. Many times you will teach in classrooms where the permanent teacher has already established consequences for inappropriate behavior. Using these established consequences helps maintain continuity of the learning environment for students and means that you do not have to develop consequences of your own. In situations where you do have to devise and implement consequences, keep the following in mind. First of all, maintain the permanent teacher's consequences if at all possible. If you can't, when possible, consequences should be a natural outcome of inappropriate behavior. An example of this is if a student doesn't work on the assignment, then they'll need to finish before they can participate in the next fun activity that you have planned. Next, be careful that consequences don't provide undue attention to a misbehaving student. This can quickly become a coercive method. If it causes any sort of embarrassment, it is coercive. And remember that what's negative, a negative consequence to one student might not be negative to another. For example, two girls are in the back of the class talking. If you use proximity first and walk near them, one student stops talking and gets right on task. We know that's a negative consequence for her. And so she got back on task, but the other student kept talking, so we know that proximity isn't a negative consequence for her. So then maybe you'll need to talk to the student individually. Next, consequences should be administered quickly and quietly without getting emotionally involved, and we talked about that earlier. Lastly, don't punish the whole class for the misdeeds of one or two students. That's an easy way to become disliked as a substitute teacher. All consequences should be reasonable, appropriate, and in accordance with school district and school policies. If you're unsure of what the school policies are, maybe during a conference period or break during the day, ask the school secretary if you can have a copy of the school policies and review them. Thank you so much for reviewing this webinar. I have had one question that we do have a few minutes to address. And the question is in regards to what should we do in case of a fight? And in this situation, remember that a fight is most easily taken care of prior to its beginning. When I was teaching, I would step into the halls between classes because bullying incidents occur most often in the hallways or in the restrooms. So teachers would always take time to be in the hallways or the restrooms during breaks. And as I was standing in the hall one day, I noticed two students who were circling each other. They looked very much like my dog and my cat right before they fight. And I remember the school officer saying, students don't want to fight, but they are not going to back down. So give them an excuse not to fight. And so doing this, I walked over and I said, hey fellas, is there anything else I can help you with? And the boys immediately scampered away in different directions. I tell you this story to help you realize that breaking up a fight beforehand can be simple. If a fight does break out, do not ever step in between these two students or try to break it up. Send a student to get help as quickly as possible. And if you want to try to break it up, you can make a startling noise like slamming some books down on a desk or something, and then say extremely calmly, I need you two to separate, and say that over and over. I need you to separate and go sit against the wall. I need you two to separate and sit against the wall. You remaining calm is going to diffuse the situation. The students might not break up the fight, but it will help the students around not get too emotionally involved and time for the principal or whoever to come and solve the problem. But you being calm will be extremely key. I hope this webinar has been helpful for you today. We've covered a lot of information. It's been fun talking with you about strategies for responding to inappropriate behavior. And as always, thanks again for all you do in the classroom.